What one incident in Mississippi during the early 1960s turned the tide in the South in Mississippi the most in terms of the civil rights movement? Can you pick one?
Well, I mean, the truth of the matter is Eisenhower had preceded Kennedy in using federal force to enforce a court edict. So it wasn't that. It wasn't Ole Miss. Ole Miss, in fact, was a unifying force for an awful lot of Southern resistance. I mean, you know, by God, they're doing Reconstruction all over again. They're using federal troops to force this. It wasn't Medgar Evers' assassination, though that was a devastating thing. The truth of the matter is Medgar Evers was not as widely known outside of the state as he was in the Jackson area. He was not a high-profile performer. He was just an immensely brave and wonderful man. No, it was a freedom summer. I mean, the freedom summer ultimately brought things which a lot of very conservative people who were enthusiastic segregationists could nonetheless not stomach. I mean, just couldn't accept it, could not. And what was happening in Mississippi was the last nail in the coffin of the resistance to civil rights acts. The Civil Rights Act passes right around July 4th in the summer of '64, but it had been preceded by a wave of violence here in Mississippi and elsewhere. That, in effect, says the feds are now fully enlisted. It ain't just the courts. It isn't the occasional use, abuse, or whatever of troops. It's the government. And Lyndon sends in more FBI agents to infiltrate the Klan and other resistance groups than he had in the Communist Party, for God's sake. I mean, every third guy under a sheet was an FBI agent, which had its effect also on the scene. And then '65, the Voting Rights Act is in truth arising from all this. But the Voting Rights Act is sort of the, you're over, kid. I mean, you know, it won't happen immediately, but it is over because suddenly folks are going to be having a vote and a say in who it is that's running the show. And it was also useful by the time that was over to know how to talk across lines. But it was the middle '60s.
You know, Greenville was different from other cities in Mississippi during this period. It had a reputation for being the most racially enlightened city in Mississippi. Was it really?
Well.
And how deep did that go?
Yeah, well, look, every one of us who was white, who was born into the South of my time, arrived into an environment in which, with your mother's milk, you understood that the essence of the civilization was white supremacy. I mean, it was not a debatable point, segregation. It doesn't matter what family it was in. And if the family disagreed, you sure as hell weren't going to talk about it publicly. Greenville was certainly in that category, as all were. It just so happened that there was, in much of the white leadership which preceded the arrival of anybody named Carter, and most specifically in the Percy leadership, something which is a phrase much used and rarely followed, which was noblesse oblige, in which the oblige actually trumped noblesse, and in which the notion that you really had to keep the worst things from happening even while you were defending segregation. And you had to make sure that those who were somewhat outside that magic circle I was talking about were not going to be persecuted, i.e. the non-white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And that was a Percy tradition. It has been much denigrated and much analyzed and often, in fact, contradicted by individual acts. But the atmosphere in Greenville was different because they said, we're not going to play it as though we're a bunch of ravening animals going after black folks. That was part of it. The paper, my dad, was an important part of it. He was, as I think I've said, as ardent a defender of the South as he was a critic, but he was both. And I think that was heeded. I think that for a lot of reasons, we had this sort of stunning reality of turning out lots of really good writers. And those lots of really good writers also created a certain kind of mystique about what this place is different. And that they were not all named Percy. I mean, Shelby Foote and Josephine Haxton, Ellen Douglas was her name for the writing, and others. And Dad's 22 books, for that matter. And there was that. It was the heterogeneous nature of the white community. And it was very much a matter of the enduring refrain, we're different. We're not like those people who get the headlines, who kill people, who burn things. We're not going to let that happen. Not one of those who were pushing that doctrine could in any way be called integrationists. They just simply weren't. But they were people who believed within the system a great deal in decency, and were people who were very conservative. And since what people now seem to think is conservative is actually reactionary, let me tell you what I mean by conservative. People who know that the best way to preserve much of your society is to give away some of it in the face of demand for change. To be constantly open, not merely for the defense of the past, but to adapt to change. And Greenville was doing that all the time. First town in the state to actually build equal physical facilities, segregated all the way, but actually saying, ah, yes, we probably ought to live up to this. And so the two identical swimming pools, the new high school buildings, all this stuff was going on before 54. We were really just so adamant about the notion that we were different. I mean, the editorial policy of the paper and my dad's speeches and writings, our town is different. It was a great banner to advance down the long road which we thought would lead to economic, if not supremacy, at least good times. And it was extremely useful. In 1950, we bring in Alexander Carpet Mill. We bring in Atkinsall Division of Borg Warner, metalworking, Moso's Crew, metalworking. We had 4 metalworking plants there. We were attractive because it seemed to be a place like Atlanta in which stability trumped absolute fealty to segregation, which we were still thoroughly segregated. I think everybody saw that it was good business to not be brutal, not be over the top. In any case, believe me, much of that leadership, thanks to my dad, incidentally, I'm a little further down the road in my sort of notion of where we ought to be than he was. But that's because I was standing on his shoulders, and also because circumstances were changing, so that what I did later would never have been possible except for the evolution beforehand. And a lot of Greenville's leadership thought I was the second generation of crazy liberals. But they didn't, whatever they thought about change, the one thing they thought was, we are not going to let the thugs run this town. We're not going to let that happen. But carefully conceding territory, no large-scale retreat. We were segregationists, but we were extremely smart segregationists at the leadership level. And I was a little bit outside that circle, but in any case. So when the real crunch came, when finally the court said, no more delay, no nothing else, the place that John Doerr, Mr. Civil Rights up at the Justice Department, knew to come was to fly to Greenville to get us to take the voluntary step of integrating the schools. And it was a place he knew he could come and say, hey, we can do this hard, we can do this easy. You guys have always been smart about doing it easy. How about being the lead mule? And Greenville did that. And it was wrought out in intense meetings of the leadership. It was not just something happen like that. And a lot of leadership to the last day of their breath hated everything that had happened. But we're glad that it had not wrecked the town. Look, the police force spent its time protecting demonstrators, not whooping on them. And that's the fact. You can look it up. Where everywhere else around, they were knocking the hell out of them. Al Hollingsworth, Bill Burnley, later mayor, I would add Bill Burnley, but at any rate, Mayor Bill Burnley were just being good cops. The fact that they had more informers in the civil rights movement than they had even in the Klan also proved that they were the modern kind of cop, but they were very good. Stokely Carmichael, the great hard ass of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, repeatedly called Greenville the rest and recreation center of the civil rights movement, that they could come here and relax and be outside the pressure points of the state generally.
You know, you were, and your father before you, the Delta Democrat Times was a zealous civic booster. Was that a survival strategy to win support for the newspaper among the city's leadership, or was that from some deeper held conviction?
My father was such a faithful son of the South that the one thing he felt always was whatever you could do to improve the economic status of the place you were living, you should try to do. That the South had been down so long that it might look like up to some people, but it was time for it to get up. And a newspaper was a great vehicle for encouraging change along those lines. Look, a lot of the Delta planter class hated the idea of industrialization, hated the idea of importing new occupations, because they wanted that labor untouched either by higher wages or by competition for bodies, generally speaking. And so for a good part of the time when we were using the Balanced Agriculture with Industry Act to bring these plants in, it was over some political dead bodies of planters who hated it. About the time that we were cresting in that moment of trying to balance our economies, of course, we got to the culmination of both the mechanization and the chemicalization of Delta agriculture. So all of a sudden, that restraint from the planter class went away because they didn't have any use for the labor they had. And indeed, if they were singularly not noblesse oblige, they started kicking people out of the shacks they had been living in forever because they were now no longer field hands and serfs, but were just bodies getting in their way. But all of a sudden, you had this vast number of people who were not employed out in the country, and so everybody knew something had to be done, though, believe me, at no time did people say, what we really need is really high-priced jobs here, because everybody was terrified in the status quo places that those higher paying jobs would provide really unendurable pressure on their bottom lines. So there were plants we turned away because they were too good. I'm saying we here collectively because I am here speaking now, when I say that, as one of the leadership class in Greenville. There were lots of debates about it internally, but the net result is what I said.